2025. The world gasped in disbelief. The Nobel Peace Prize, the highest honor of them all, was awarded to Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader from one of Africa's poorest nations. In Western capitals, silence turned to outrage. In Africa, celebration erupted like wildfire. But behind the applause and the anger lies a story far more dangerous, far more mysterious than the headlines reveal. How did a soldier dismissed as a radical rise to become a global icon of peace? What did the Nobel Committee see that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge? This isn't just the tale of a medal. It's the story of betrayal, hidden struggles, and a turning point in history that could redefine the future of an entire continent. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may change the way you see power, resistance, and the world itself. And if you find this story as powerful as I do, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more cinematic stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. The world was not prepared. On a cold autumn morning in Geneva, the Nobel Committee stepped to the podium, their voices trembling as cameras flashed. The Nobel Peace Prize for 2025, the chairman announced, is awarded to Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The room froze. For a full breath, there was silence. Not applause, not cheers, just stunned disbelief. Western journalists glanced at each other, pens hesitating above their notepads. In newsrooms from Washington to Paris, anchors stuttered live on air. Markets dipped, governments called emergency meetings, and intelligence agencies scrambled to update files that suddenly felt outdated. Why him? Why now? The Nobel was supposed to be safe, predictable, a crown placed gently upon the heads of figures who reinforced the existing order. But this time was different. The world had heard of Traoré, of course, the young soldier who seized power in one of Africa's poorest nations. They had painted him as a radical, a nationalist, perhaps even a threat. Yet here he stood, cloaked not in military uniform but in the aura of legitimacy, holding in his hands the single most powerful symbol of peace the global stage could bestow. Within minutes, the backlash began. In the streets of Paris, crowds shouted that the Nobel had been hijacked. In Washington, senators called it a mistake of history. Headlines screamed words like shock, scandal, and betrayal. But in Ouagadougou, something entirely different unfolded. The people flooded the streets, waving flags, drumming, dancing in dust-choked squares. Women ululated, children climbed rooftops, old men wept openly. Across Africa, the news spread like wildfire. Radios crackled in desert villages, televisions blared in crowded cities. For millions, it was not just an award. It was vindication, proof that their struggle, long ignored, had finally been recognized on the highest stage. Still, questions burned in the air. What had Traoré done that the world did not yet know? How did a man once dismissed as a mere military officer manage to bend the judgment of the world's most guarded institution? In the corridors of power, whispers multiplied. Some said Traoré had unearthed secrets that threatened old empires. Others claimed he had built an invisible alliance stretching far beyond Africa's borders. A few believed he had uncovered something so profound, so unstoppable, that even the Nobel Committee had no choice but to honor him. Before history forced their hand, what the world saw was a headline. What it did not see was the shadow war, the hidden journey, the chain of betrayals and revelations that led to this moment. The cameras caught his calm smile as he accepted the prize, but behind that smile lay years of struggle, silence, and sacrifice. And, as the world gasped in disbelief, one question echoed louder than all the rest. What had Ibrahim Traoré done to shake the foundations of the world itself? The Nobel Prize announcement was not the beginning of Ibrahim Traoré's story. It was only the surface of something far deeper, something that began in silence and shadows. To understand how he reached that moment in Geneva, one had to return to the dust of Burkina Faso, to a land where hunger was a daily companion and where hope was often a luxury people could not afford. The weight of hunger in the heart of West Africa, Burkina Faso stood as one of the poorest nations on earth. Fields once fertile now cracked under relentless droughts. In villages, children with sunken eyes carried empty bowls, waiting for food that did not come. Mothers whispered lullabies not to comfort their babies, but to distract them from hunger pangs. The International Monetary Fund sat like a shadow over the land, tightening its grip with contracts, debts, and ultimatums. Burkina Faso's gold, the wealth beneath its soil, left the country in trucks and planes bound for Europe and America, yet its people starved. This was the world Ibrahim Traoré inherited when he rose to power. He was young, too young in the eyes of his rivals, but he carried something older than age, a burden of history, of centuries of colonization, exploitation, and betrayal. And he knew that if he followed the same path as leaders before him, nothing would ever change. The silent pilgrimage, yet what puzzled his enemies most was not his defiance. It was his silence. Unlike others who shouted slogans and made fiery declarations, Traoré disappeared for long stretches of time. Reports placed him in hidden corners of Africa, walking among farmers in Mali, meeting scholars in Dakar, kneeling beside miners in Ghana, sitting quietly with elders under the shade of baobab trees. He avoided cameras, avoided fanfare. He seemed to be gathering something, but no one could say what. Intelligence agencies grew nervous. French operatives tracked him across borders. American satellites followed his convoys. British analysts intercepted fragments of conversations. But the trail was always incomplete, always elusive. He spoke in whispers, left no paper trail, and trusted no one outside his circle. What was he building? Some said he was searching for alliances. Others believed he was after knowledge, piecing together fragments of African history erased by colonial textbooks. And a few, the ones who understood the most, feared he was searching for a weapon, not of steel or fire, but of ideas. The legacy of Sankara everywhere he went. The ghost of Thomas Sankara followed him. Sankara, the revolutionary president who once dared to defy the West, only to be assassinated in his prime. His name still lingered in Burkina Faso like an unhealed wound. Traoré walked in Sankara's shadow, but not to imitate him. Instead, he listened. To Sankara's speeches, to the stories of old revolutionaries, to the lessons of betrayal. He knew that Sankara had been bold, but he had been too visible, too loud, too vulnerable. If Traoré was to succeed, he could not simply be a copy. He would need to be something else, harder to grasp, harder to destroy. A ghost moving through the cracks of history. The three watchers, but while he searched for Africa's hidden strength, others were searching for him. In dimly lit conference rooms in Washington, Paris, and London, files on Ibrahim Traoré piled higher each month. His face stared from briefing papers marked confidential. His name echoed through intelligence chatter. They called him the Silent One. To the West, Traoré was not just a young soldier in an obscure African nation. He was a threat to the order they had built. If he discovered something powerful enough to inspire not just Burkina Faso but all of Africa, their grip would loosen, and so they watched. The CIA analyzed satellite images of villages he visited. French intelligence infiltrated his advisors. Private corporations hired mercenaries to destabilize his projects. Each move he made was shadowed by unseen eyes. But what frustrated them most was his unpredictability. He did not build armies. He did not amass wealth. He did not even cling to power for its own sake. He moved differently, as though he were following a map invisible to everyone else. The people in darkness. Meanwhile, his people suffered. The sanctions imposed by international banks began to bite. Prices of food and medicine doubled, then tripled. Fuel became scarce. Hospitals turned patients away. Famine crept like a slow-moving storm. Mothers buried their children under shallow graves. Fathers left their families in search of work they would never find. Soldiers whispered doubts, wondering if their young leader could save them, or if he would doom them further. And yet, even in despair, a strange kind of loyalty grew. Unlike leaders before him, Traoré did not live above the suffering. He walked among the people, ate their food, shared their grief. He was seen standing at funerals, lifting sacks of grain, carrying water. He did not speak much, but when he did, he spoke of a vision, not of begging, not of dependence, but of freedom. Someday, he told them quietly, we will not measure ourselves by what the world gives us. We will measure ourselves by what we create. The whispers of a discovery, then came the whispers. Somewhere in his silent journeys, It was said that Traoré had uncovered something extraordinary. What it was, no one could confirm. Rumors spoke of ancient manuscripts hidden in desert libraries, of lost knowledge passed down through griots and elders, of forgotten strategies to break the chains of economic enslavement. Others believed it was something more tangible, a secret resource, a breakthrough in energy, a technology capable of shifting the balance of power. Whatever it was, it became the obsession of those who sought to control him. The IMF tightened sanctions, corporations bribed ministers, and rival generals plotted quietly. But Traoré remained unmoved. If he had found something, he carried it like a fire hidden beneath ashes, invisible yet impossible to extinguish. The mystery deepens. By the time the Nobel Prize announcement came, the West saw only the surface. A leader draped in ceremonial robes, smiling humbly before the cameras. But beneath that moment lay years of shadows, betrayals, and silent victories they could not comprehend. The truth was that Traoré had been fighting not one battle, but many. Against hunger, against foreign domination, against betrayal from within, and against time itself. He had faced assassins in the night, betrayal from trusted allies, and endless pressure from powers that believed they could bend him. And yet, each time, he emerged unbroken. The world asked, why him? But the real question was, what did he know that they did not? Shadows. Within Burkina Faso's enemies were not only outside its borders. Within the government itself, whispers of betrayal spread like poison. 3 of Traoré's own ministers, men who once smiled beside him on balconies, who clapped as he spoke of sovereignty, had secretly opened back channels with foreign embassies. They promised access to gold mines, trade concessions, even military cooperation, if only the West helped them replace him. They underestimated him. Traoré listened. More than he spoke. He noticed how one general's eyes flickered nervously in meetings, how another's convoy stopped too often at certain villas owned by foreign businessmen. He allowed them to believe they were invisible. He let the rot reveal itself, piece by piece. At night, when the city slept, he studied reports delivered by young officers who owed him nothing but loyalty. He pieced together the web of betrayal. He did not confront them, not yet. Instead, he allowed the conspiracy to grow, because in their ambition lay proof of the larger system that fed them, and while they plotted, he traveled again, vanishing, into the Sahara, into the forests, into villages no one in power ever visited. The hidden Mappet was on one of these journeys that rumors began to circulate of a map. No one knew if it was literal or metaphorical, but those who had seen him, returned from his desert travels, said he carried old manuscripts wrapped in cloth, pages so fragile they crumbled at his touch. Others swore he was meeting with scientists and engineers quietly working on something extraordinary. Whatever it was, he began to speak differently when he returned. His words became sharper, more deliberate. He spoke of a future not bound by aid, loans, or foreign dictates. He spoke as though he had glimpsed something the rest could not yet see. The mystery deepened. French intelligence cabled reports back to Paris. Subject is acquiring sensitive knowledge. Objective unknown. The CIA issued warnings. If he consolidates this vision, containment will be difficult. Corporations pressured governments to act swiftly, fearing the collapse of resource monopolies. And yet Traoré moved calmly, quietly, like a man playing a game of chess 10 moves ahead. The silent war, the war against him, did not come with open armies. It came silently. A shipment of grain meant for starving villages was poisoned. Power plants mysteriously failed, plunging towns into darkness. A convoy carrying medicine was ambushed by unknown gunmen, though everyone knew whose interests they served. And then came the media war. International outlets painted him as a dictator, a radical, a soldier intoxicated by power. They never showed the villages where he rebuilt schools, or the fields where he worked beside farmers. They never showed the tears of widows when he stood at their husbands' graves. Instead, they crafted a caricature, because a man made into a villain could be destroyed without consequence. But within Burkina Faso, the people saw differently. They saw a leader who walked among them, who did not hide behind walls, who spoke of freedom not as a slogan, but as a necessity. The more the outside world attacked him, the more his people drew close. The attempt. The first assassination attempt. came quietly. A sniper waited along the road to Bobo Dioulasso, positioned where the dust rose high enough to obscure sight. His orders were simple: remove Traoré, and chaos would do the rest. But the bullet never reached him. The sniper's rifle jammed, a mechanical failure so rare it baffled his handlers. By the time he cleared the chamber, Traoré's convoy had passed. The second attempt was less subtle, a bomb planted near a school where he was scheduled to speak. But at the last moment, he changed his route without explanation, choosing instead to visit a nearby hospital. When the explosion ripped through the abandoned street, there were no casualties. By the third attempt, whispers of divine protection surrounded him. Some said he had dreams that guided his choices. Others said he had eyes everywhere. What the world didn't see was his network: farmers, students, market women, soldiers, all quietly feeding him information. They were his shield. They were his intelligence service. They were his strength, the scholar's warning. One of the pivotal figures in his silent journey was an old scholar from Timbuktu, a man who had spent his life preserving manuscripts written centuries ago. These texts, ignored by the West, contained ideas of governance, economy, and resilience crafted long before colonialism. The scholar, bent with age, placed one fragile book into Traoré's hands. "They have tried to erase us," he whispered, "but we are not erased. You must remember what they want us to forget." That night, under the desert stars, Traoré read by lantern light. The words spoke of dignity, of collective wealth, of sovereignty, not as isolation, but as unity. It was not just history. It was a blueprint. When he returned to Ouagadougou, he was no longer the same. He had glimpsed the depth of Africa's stolen memory, and he carried it like a weapon. The pressure builds. By late 2024, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The IMF delivered an ultimatum: relinquish control of gold exports, or face total economic isolation. Fuel shipments slowed to a trickle. Hospitals reported shortages of basic supplies. Inside Burkina Faso, the three ministers who plotted against him moved more boldly, believing the people would turn against their leader once desperation set in. But they miscalculated. The people, though hungry, understood who was starving them. They saw foreign hands behind their suffering, and they clung to Traoré, not as a perfect savior, but as the only one who refused to bow. The conspirators grew desperate. They contacted foreign agents, begging for immediate intervention. But before they could act, Traoré struck first. The exposure in a dramatic broadcast that shook the nation, Traoré revealed intercepted communications, recordings of the ministers, negotiating with foreign embassies, selling the nation's future piece by piece. He did not shout. He did not rage. He simply played the tapes. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. The ministers fled, but they found no refuge. Even the West, embarrassed by exposure, could not protect them. They became exiles, their names cursed in the streets. For Traoré, the exposure was more than victory. It was a declaration. He was not merely resisting, he was dismantling the networks that had strangled his nation for decades. The unseen alliance, and then came the revelation that no one expected. Through quiet travels, encrypted letters, and secret meetings, Traoré had been building something invisible, an alliance of thinkers, leaders, and visionaries across Africa and beyond. Not generals, not corporations, but farmers, scientists, artists, philosophers. They called themselves the Circle. Their purpose was simple yet radical: to draft a new blueprint for liberation, one that combined ancient wisdom with modern science, energy independence, agricultural resilience, cultural revival, each piece carefully assembled. And Traoré stood at the center, not as ruler, but as convener. The West had underestimated him. They thought he sought power for himself. In truth, he sought power for his people, and that was far more dangerous. The storm before Geneva by the dawn of 2025. The storm reached its peak. The West applied every pressure it could. Media campaigns smeared him as unstable. Banks froze accounts linked to his government. Corporations threatened to withdraw entirely. But something unexpected happened. Protests erupted. Not in Africa, but in Europe. Students in Paris and Berlin marched with signs bearing his name. Activists in London quoted his speeches. Even in New York, small groups gathered, demanding an end to neo-colonial exploitation. The world was shifting. What began as whispers in villages had become chants on foreign streets. And then, in the quiet chambers of Geneva, the Nobel Committee faced a decision unlike any in its history. For months they had debated, argued, split between those who saw Traoré as a beacon of peace and those who feared the consequences of honoring him. Governments leaned heavily on them, warning of destabilization, hinting at funding cuts, threatening reputations. Yet the evidence lay before them. Famine resisted, sovereignty defended, corruption exposed, dignity restored. At last, against all odds, the decision was made, a world on edge. When the announcement finally came, the world's shock was not just at the award itself. It was at the realization that everything they thought they knew about Ibrahim Traoré was incomplete. For years, he had walked in silence, gathering strength, uncovering forgotten truths, weaving alliances invisible to the naked eye. The Nobel Prize was not simply recognition, it was exposure. It was the world's accidental confession that he had won a battle they had tried desperately to bury. And yet, as the cameras flashed and his people danced in the streets, one chilling truth remained. The story was only beginning. Because if Traoré had achieved all this in silence, what would he do now, with the world finally forced to listen? The backlash begins. The Nobel Committee's announcement reverberated like a gunshot across the world. For a fleeting moment, silence followed, as though the planet itself paused to process the impossible. But silence gave way to fury. In Washington, senators demanded an investigation. How could a young soldier from Burkina Faso, a man the West had branded as radical and destabilizing, be honored on the world stage? In Paris, politicians spoke of an insult to democratic values. Headlines across Europe screamed words like outrage and catastrophe. But behind the outrage lay fear. The Nobel had not merely elevated Traoré, it had validated him. For millions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the prize was proof that resistance was possible, that dignity could be recognized. The old order sensed its grip slipping, and so retaliation began. Sanctions without mercy, the IMF moved swiftly. Within weeks, a new package of sanctions was approved. Loans were frozen. Accounts linked to Burkina Faso's government were suspended. Corporations abruptly withdrew contracts, citing instability. Ships carrying grain were diverted mid-journey. Fuel convoys were mysteriously delayed. International banks quietly instructed clients to halt transactions involving Burkina Faso. The goal was clear: starve the nation into submission until its people rose against their leader in desperation. But something unexpected happened. Instead of turning on Traoré, the people rallied around him. They began growing food collectively in abandoned lots. Farmers organized seed-sharing networks. Volunteers carried water by hand to keep fields alive. The hunger was real, the suffering immense. But for the first time, survival felt like defiance. The sanctions meant to break them instead deepened their unity. Betrayal in the shadows. Not everyone shared this loyalty. In dimly lit rooms in Ouagadougou, remnants of the exiled ministers' networks still festered. Former generals, stripped of power, whispered to foreign agents. A plot began to form, not to assassinate Traoré directly, but to fracture the fragile unity he had built. Disinformation campaigns spread through social media, painting him as a secret tyrant, claiming he was hoarding resources, accusing him of corruption. Leaked documents, some forged, some real, circulated widely, suggesting Traoré had struck. Hidden deals with China or Russia. The goal was to plant doubt, to erode the belief that he was different from the leaders before him. For a time it worked. Soldiers grumbled in barracks, students debated in universities. Market women asked why food was scarce if their leader truly cared for them. But then came the moment that turned suspicion into loyalty once more. The night at the hospital in the middle of the famine, when hospitals ran out of medicine, Traoré appeared unannounced at the largest medical center in the capital. No cameras, no speeches, only a convoy of trucks carrying supplies gathered through secret networks of supporters across Africa. Doctors wept as they received boxes of antibiotics, syringes, and bandages. Mothers clutched their children, stunned to see their president among them. When word spread, The disinformation collapsed. The documents were forgotten, the rumors silenced. The people saw with their own eyes that he had not abandoned them, and the conspirators, once again, were forced into silence. The circle moves. Meanwhile, the circle, Traoré's hidden alliance of thinkers, scientists, and visionaries, began to move more openly. In Senegal, engineers unveiled a prototype for solar-powered irrigation pumps. In Ghana, economists published radical models for debt cancellation. In Mali, poets wrote verses that spread like wildfire across the internet, declaring the dawn of a new era. Each act was small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet revolution, coordinated across borders, grounded in ideas, rather than armies. The West understood the danger. Armies could be defeated, leaders assassinated, but ideas, especially those rooted in dignity and sovereignty, were far harder to kill. And so, they escalated the war. The hidden-hand corporate boardrooms buzzed with anxiety. Mining companies feared losing access to African gold. Oil magnates whispered of energy independence movements spreading. Tech corporations worried that Traoré's alliance might push for digital sovereignty, breaking Western monopolies. So they did what corporations had always done. They hired mercenaries. Mysterious militias began appearing along Burkina Faso's borders. Villages were raided at night, their attackers vanishing without a trace. Bridges were blown up, disrupting supply routes. Refugees poured into the capital, their stories filled with terror. The message was clear: resist, and chaos will follow. But instead of folding, the people fought back. Hunters from rural communities armed themselves with ancient rifles. Youth patrols formed to guard villages. Soldiers, though underpaid and underfed, stood their ground. And Traoré? He remained calm. Each attack only deepened his conviction that the storm meant he was on the right path. The whisper of the manuscript. Then came the leak that changed everything. A journalist in Dakar claimed to have seen fragments of an ancient manuscript linked to Traoré's travels. The manuscript, he wrote, contained a philosophy of governance and resilience that predated colonialism by centuries, a blueprint for a sovereign Africa. The story spread like wildfire. Some dismissed it as myth, others as propaganda. But the timing was undeniable. Suddenly, the whispers of Traoré's hidden discovery seemed real. Intelligence agencies scrambled to confirm. Scholars demanded access. Corporations feared what might happen if such knowledge ignited the continent. And the Nobel Committee, quietly, behind closed doors, began to take notice. The gathering storm by mid-2025, protests had erupted worldwide. In Lagos, students marched with placards reading, "Africa is not for sale." In Johannesburg, workers carried banners quoting Traoré's speeches. In Cairo, poets chanted verses about liberation. But it wasn't only Africa. In Latin America, activists invoked his name alongside Bolívar and Chávez. In Asia, students in Manila and Jakarta painted murals of him, declaring solidarity against imperialism. The more the West tried to suppress his vision, the more it spread beyond their reach. And yet, within Burkina Faso, life grew harder. Food. Shortages deepened. Hospitals struggled. Families starved. The suffering was real, and Traoré bore it heavily. At night, he walked the palace corridors alone, the weight of his nation pressing down on him. But in that darkness, he also understood. The suffering was proof of how desperate the old order was to stop him. Toward Geneva, as autumn approached, whispers reached him. His name had been shortlisted for the Nobel Peace Prize. At first, he dismissed it as a trick, a ploy to lure him into complacency. But as the weeks passed, confirmation arrived. He was indeed a candidate, though the committee itself was bitterly divided. Governments pressured the Nobel members relentlessly. Some argued awarding him would destabilize global order. Others believed ignoring him would destroy the prize's credibility. The debate stretched for weeks behind closed doors. Papers were written, votes counted, alliances shifted, and while the world speculated, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent. He visited no capitals, lobbied no ambassadors, gave no speeches. He walked instead among his people, rebuilding homes destroyed by raids, planting seeds in barren fields, standing quietly beside mothers who had lost their children. If he was to be recognized, it would not be because he begged for it, it would be because the truth could no longer be ignored. The rising tension on the night before the announcement, the world felt heavy with suspense. In Paris, politicians drafted emergency statements. In Washington, analysts prepared for contingency scenarios. In London, intelligence officers whispered of destabilization. And in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets were silent. No one celebrated, no one speculated. People simply waited, holding their breath. They knew that whatever came next would not be ordinary. It would either cement their suffering or change the course of history. And Ibrahim Traoré, awake in his chamber, staring at the stars beyond his window, knew the same. He did not know if the Nobel would come. He did not know if he would live to see its impact. But he knew one thing with certainty. The world was already shifting, and no amount of resistance could turn back the tide. The storm was now at its peak, and all roads led to Geneva. What happened next would not only decide Traoré's fate, but the fate of a continent, and perhaps the balance of the world itself. The silence before the storm Geneva was unusually cold that October morning, though the streets swelled with heat from the bodies of thousands who had gathered outside the Nobel headquarters. Flags waved in the crisp air, not only the official banners of nations, but hand-painted cloths stitched with slogans, poems, and portraits. Some were jubilant, students chanting Traoré's name, activists painting murals of a fist-breaking chains. Others were furious, placards calling him a dictator in disguise, a pawn of rival powers. The square trembled with contradiction, with the very tension that defined the man at the center of it all. Inside, the Nobel Committee's chamber buzzed with tension. Normally, these final sessions were ceremonial. Votes were counted, formalities observed, announcements prepared, but not this time. The committee was fractured. Never in its history had the prize been so contested, so bitterly debated. The battle in the committee. At one end of the table sat Professor Lindström, an elderly Swedish historian. Her hands shook as she clutched her papers, but her voice was steady. Ibrahim Traoré, she declared, has achieved something no statesman of this century has managed. He has united the voiceless. He has articulated a philosophy that goes beyond borders, beyond nations. To deny him recognition would be to deny history itself. Across from her, Lord Havisham of Britain slammed his fist on the table. History? He barked. What history? This man is no peacemaker. He is a soldier, a coup leader. His so-called philosophy has plunged his nation into chaos, hunger, violence, repression. Is that what we honor now? A murmur ran through the room. Madame Dufresne of France leaned forward, her voice cold as steel. Let us not be naive. Awarding this man would embolden every populist, every strong man who claims to act in the name of the people. We would be opening the floodgates of instability. But another member, a Kenyan scholar named Dr. Achieng, spoke softly yet firmly. You fear instability because it threatens your order. But for us, instability is not a theory. It is life. And for once, life has produced a leader who refuses to kneel. If the Nobel Prize does not recognize this courage, then what purpose does it serve? The room fell silent. For hours the debate raged. Votes were taken, overturned, retaken. At one point, word leaked that intelligence officers from major powers were pressuring certain members, threatening diplomatic fallout. By nightfall, the committee had reached an impasse. The decision would go to a final vote at dawn. Traoré. In the shadows, meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré sat in a modest hotel room on the outskirts of Geneva. Unlike other nominees, he had refused luxury. He had arrived with no entourage, no suits, no carefully staged photographs. Only two companions sat with him, an old comrade from the military and a young poet who had joined his circle. They tried to speak, to pass the time, but Traoré's silence hung heavy. His eyes were fixed on the window, where the city lights flickered like restless stars. Do you want it? The poet finally asked. Traoré turned, surprised. The prize? She clarified. He did not answer at once. His hands rested on his knees, his breathing slow. Finally, he whispered, I want justice. If the prize serves that, then yes. If not, then it is nothing. His comrade leaned forward. The world won't forgive you if you win. You know that. I do, Traoré replied softly. But the world has never forgiven those who refuse to kneel. Outside, protesters' chants echoed faintly through the glass. He closed his eyes. As though listening to the rhythm of a storm he could not yet see. Midnight intrigue. That night, Geneva was not calm. In back rooms of embassies, frantic calls were made. Intelligence reports circulated warning that a Nobel victory for Traoré could trigger mass uprisings in Africa, even in parts of Asia and Latin America. Western leaders demanded intervention. Some suggested delaying the announcement, citing security concerns. Others proposed creating a new category, an unprecedented maneuver, to sidestep awarding Traoré directly. Rumors swirled that mercenaries were moving quietly near the hotel where he stayed, their orders unclear. Some whispered of an assassination attempt, a final desperate measure to prevent the unimaginable. But as dawn neared, none of these shadows bore fruit. The storm of conspiracy remained just that, a storm. The committee was about to speak, the announcement. The grand hall was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from every corner of the globe filled the seats, their cameras poised. Representatives of governments leaned in stiff anticipation. Outside, the chants had grown deafening, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat. At precisely 10 a.m., the chair of the Nobel Committee stepped onto the podium. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She adjusted the microphone, inhaled, and began. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and citizens of the world. The hall fell silent. This year, the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded not to comfort the powerful, but to honor the powerless. It is awarded to a man who, in defiance of impossible odds, has given voice to dignity, sovereignty, and the unyielding spirit of freedom. She paused, as though the weight of her words pressed against her chest. The Nobel Peace Prize for 2025 is awarded to Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. The shockwave. The hall erupted. Some gasped, others shouted. Applause thundered. From certain corners, while furious boos echoed from others, journalists scrambled, their voices colliding in a chaos of disbelief. Outside, the crowd exploded. Cheers roared, drums pounded, flags waved wildly. But across the square, rival protesters hurled curses, some breaking into violent clashes. Geneva police struggled to contain the frenzy. In capitals around the world, emergency meetings were called. Washington released a statement within minutes, condemning the decision. Paris declared deep disappointment. London warned of grave consequences. But in Ouagadougou, bells rang from mosques and churches alike. Villagers danced in dusty streets. Children shouted his name. Old women wept with joy. For them, this was not merely a prize. It was vindication. The walk to the podium. Inside the hall, Ibrahim Traoré rose slowly from his seat. The world's eyes fixed upon him. Cameras zoomed in on his every movement, capturing the plain uniform he still wore, the same faded green he had donned since the day of the coup. He walked with steady steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. His face betrayed no triumph, no arrogance, only calm resolve. When he reached the podium, he did not touch the golden medal placed before him. Instead, he looked out at the sea of faces, the storm of expectation, the maelstrom of judgment. And then he spoke. The speech. I stand before you not as a victor, he began, his voice deep, resonant, carrying effortlessly through the hall, but as a witness to suffering, to hunger, to the weight of centuries carried on the backs of my people and all peoples who have known the cruelty of chains. He paused. Silence gripped the room. This medal does not belong to me. It belongs to the mothers who plant seeds in barren soil. It belongs to the children who walk barefoot to schools that do not exist. It belongs to the miners who sweat enriches foreign lands while their own families starve. It belongs to the dead, whose voices we must not forget. His eyes swept the hall, steady and unflinching. You call this the Nobel Peace Prize. But peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the presence of justice. And there is no justice where nations are trapped in debts they did not choose, where food is withheld as a weapon, where sovereignty is denied at the point of a gun. The hall quivered. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, others stared transfixed. If my people suffer for this recognition, then let the world know. We will suffer with dignity. If my name becomes a curse in your capitals, so be it. For I'm not here to please you. I am here to remind you that the age of silence is over. He placed his hand over the medal but did not lift it. And so, I accept this prize not for myself, but for the unborn generations who will one day inherit a world where justice is not begged for, but lived. Let this be the beginning, not the end. He stepped back. The hall erupted again, some cheering wildly, others storming out in protest. The aftermath in Geneva outside, the city was in chaos. Supporters marched, singing songs of freedom. Opponents hurled stones. Riot police clashed with demonstrators. Inside embassies, phones rang off the hook. Governments demanded answers, debated sanctions, whispered of covert plans, but no amount of fury could erase the fact. The Nobel Prize had been awarded. The world could not take it back. And in that single moment, Ibrahim Traoré had crossed a threshold. He was no longer merely a soldier, a leader, or even a symbol. He had become a story the world could not ignore, a story written into the annals of history, for better or worse. The return to silence. That night, Traoré returned to his hotel. He placed the medal on a plain wooden table. He did not look at it. He sat instead by the window, listening to the city's noise fading into the distance. The poet who accompanied him asked, "Do you feel victorious?" He shook his head. "This is not victory," he murmured. "This is the beginning of a greater war." And as he stared out into the night, the world churned restlessly around him, divided, electrified, forever changed. The Nobel ceremony had ended, but the storm it unleashed was only beginning. In Oslo, as the golden medallion rested in Ibrahim Traoré's hands, cameras broadcast his face across continents. His eyes, steady and unflinching, seemed to speak, directly to those watching from dimly lit shacks, refugee camps, crowded cities, and palaces of power. For some, his gaze carried hope. For others, defiance. Yet everyone, without exception, felt that history itself was shifting. The backlash in Western capitals, chaos simmered. Emergency briefings stretched late into the night. Politicians thundered on television. The Nobel Prize has been weaponized. Editorials accused the committee of succumbing to populism or worse, manipulation. Think tanks whispered that Traoré's recognition would embolden resistance movements across the global south. And they were right. From Dakar to Kinshasa, from Nairobi to Harare, streets filled with jubilant crowds. His face appeared on posters, murals, and hastily printed banners. To ordinary Africans, the prize was not about one man. It was about centuries of silencing finally rupturing under the weight of truth. Yet for the institutions that had long controlled Africa's destiny, this was a nightmare. The IMF warned of instability. Multinational corporations began quietly withdrawing assets from the Sahel. Intelligence services drafted plans to contain the Traoré effect. But containment was already impossible. The ripple across Africa. The morning after the ceremony, radio stations across the continent opened their broadcasts with a single refrain. Africa has risen. In villages where electricity was scarce, people huddled around battery-powered sets to hear the news repeated again and again. Teachers rewrote lesson plans overnight, telling students that they were living in an age when history turned in their favor. In Burkina Faso, where dust swirled across unpaved roads, the celebration bordered on spiritual. Mothers clutched their children, whispering that a new dawn had come. Farmers paused in their fields, raising their hands skyward. Soldiers stood taller at checkpoints, no longer merely defenders of borders, but guardians of a story the whole world now acknowledged. And in the whispers of marketplaces and university halls, a single idea spread like wildfire. If one man from Burkina Faso could shake the world, what could Africa do together? The mystery unfolds. Still, questions lingered. What exactly had pushed the Nobel Committee to choose Traoré? Rumors fed the intrigue. Some said he had presented secret evidence of decades-long financial crimes committed against Africa. Others swore he had revealed a hidden pact among African states to break free from debt slavery. A few, more mystical in tone, whispered that he had inherited the spirit of Sankara, carrying forward a prophecy written in blood and struggle. The truth was murkier, more complex, a mosaic of courage, strategy, and timing. Traoré had indeed unearthed documents proving how Africa's wealth had been siphoned away for generations. He had rallied silent leaders across continents who had grown weary of submission. And above all, he had framed the struggle not as a local resistance, but as humanity's final chance at fairness. The Nobel Prize was not given to him. It was claimed by him, wrested from a reluctant world by the sheer inevitability of his story. A divided globe as weeks passed. The reactions hardened. In Europe, some citizens began questioning their own governments, demanding explanations for why a leader like Traoré was painted as a threat. In the United States, protests erupted on university campuses, with students carrying placards that read, "If Traoré can fight, so can we." But in corridors of power, the tone darkened. Trade deals were frozen. Aid packages were suspended. Media campaigns sought to discredit him, calling him a dictator, a populist, a dangerous dreamer. And yet, for every attempt to smear him, his legend only grew. Because the world had seen the Nobel medallion in his hand, they had heard the words Ibrahim Traoré, Nobel laureate. No propaganda could erase that image. The People's Nobel soon, a phrase spread across Africa and beyond. The Nobel belongs to us. It wasn't just Burkina Faso celebrating anymore. In South Africa, churches rang their bells in his honor. In Egypt, students scrawled his name on university walls. In Ghana, markets pulsed with songs written overnight about the young lion of the Sahel. Even in countries where governments tried to suppress the story, it seeped through radio signals, whispered conversations, and smuggled newspapers. For the first time, millions felt that peace was not an abstraction decided in faraway capitals. Peace had a face, a language, a story they understood. Ibrahim Traoré's silence. Through it all, Traoré himself remained remarkably quiet. He gave no triumphant interviews. He did not gloat or proclaim victory. Instead, he returned to Burkina Faso and slipped into a silence that baffled both admirers and critics. But those closest to him understood. He knew that the Nobel was not an end, but a beginning. With the world watching, the burden was heavier than ever. One misstep could unravel everything, so he waited, watched, and listened, while the people carried his story forward. The turning tide by spring of 2026, the tide was undeniable. African nations began renegotiating old contracts with foreign companies. Several rejected IMF austerity packages, citing Traoré as their inspiration. Pan-African conferences, once ceremonial, now buzzed with genuine urgency. It was as if the Nobel had unlocked something deeper. Not just belief, but permission. Permission to imagine freedom and to demand it. In Western capitals, think tanks quietly admitted the truth. The balance of power had shifted. What they had dismissed as a symbolic award had become a catalyst for realignment. A personal victory, yet for Traoré, the greatest victory was not geopolitical. It was the sight of his people, once bowed by poverty, war, and despair, standing tall. Farmers now spoke of themselves as protectors of the land. Children dreamed not of fleeing to Europe, but of building Africa anew. Women, long silenced, rose as leaders in local councils, invoking his name as proof that change was possible. And, in quiet moments, when the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with music late into the night, Traoré allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time, he felt that Sankara's ghost could finally rest. The final question. Months later, in an interview broadcast across the continent, a journalist asked him the question that lingered in millions of minds. "Mr. President, what does this Nobel Prize mean to you?" He paused, his eyes narrowing as if he were peering not into the camera, but into the future. His voice was calm, almost solemn. "It means nothing," he said. "If it remains only mine, but if it awakens my people, if it awakens Africa, if it awakens humanity, then perhaps it means everything." The words rippled across the world, carried on screens, radios, and whispers. For some, they were a threat. For others, salvation. And as night fell over the Sahel, bonfires burned in villages where people danced and prayed, singing a single phrase that now defined an era. Africa has risen. Closing reflection, the Nobel Prize of 2025 would forever remain one of history's great shocks. Not because it crowned a young soldier turned president, but because it exposed a truth the world had tried to bury: that dignity cannot be denied forever, and that sometimes a single spark is enough to ignite a continent. And in the silence after the celebrations, a haunting question lingered, echoing through the deserts, the cities, and the hearts of millions. Was this the moment Africa broke its chains?